Final session of the conference, everybody. Welcome back for this session. I'm glad to see so many people have stayed here for the final session. I think, hopefully, that's evidence that we've kept you interested and involved, because I think there have been some really good sessions, and they've sort of, as I've said before, hung together a bit. And this final session, named Poison Chalice, what awaits the new chairman of Ofcom, seems to me to be highly relevant to a number of the issues that we've talked about. Roger Bolton is happily going to chair this panel. Really grateful to the panellists. We put this together at very short notice, just over the last 3 days, and I'm delighted that we've managed to get such a high-quality panel in such a short period of time. But now it's over to you, Roger.
Thanks very much, and thank you for staying. It's pretty timely, this question, is Ofcom fit for business? Because, as you know, a new chair of Ofcom has been appointed, or at least the government has announced their preferred candidate, who is Sir Ian Cheshire, formerly with Channel 4 and formerly running Kingfisher. And one of the questions we're going to explore, the extent to which anything fundamentally needs to change in Ofcom, or whether a new chairman with a different direction can solve some of the concerns that people have, a lot of them involving impartiality, a lot of them involving the way in which GB News has been regulated or not regulated. And we've got a very powerful panel, a very experienced panel here. At the far side is, well, as you know, Professor Stewart Purvis, former Chief Executive of ITN, but particularly relevant here was at Content and Standards Partner at Ofcom. Which period was that, by the way?
2008 to 2010.
So it started Ofcom 2003. Yeah. So yeah, about 5 minutes. 5 years. I'm sure it felt like 5 minutes. Next to us, next to Stewart, is Chris Banatvala, who was Ofcom's founding director of standards and a member of the Content Board. So you were 2003, were you?
I was started, yeah, 2003.
Right. And next to me is Professor Lee Edwards, Professor of Strategic Communications and Public Engagement at the LSE. Now, we know that the government has a real concern about online safety, because in the ad for the new chair, that was put at the front. But I think what's quite extraordinary is the range of things that Ofcom's responsible for. So should we just to give indication, because most of us think it's simply about regulating the broadcasters. Chris, just tell us what Ofcom actually is responsible for now. It's the Post, responsible for the Post Office.
It's 5 sectors. So it is broadcasting, which is obviously radio, television, but also video on demand. It's spectrum, allocation of spectrum across the board, which is very complicated. Telecoms regulation, the Post Office, and now online. So it's enormous. I think when I was there and Stuart was there, it was around 900, 800 people. I think it's now around 1,400, 1,500 people. Online is obviously incredibly difficult. It's a very complicated act, much less so, I would say, than broadcasting. So I think the new chair has a real big area to cover, but I don't think it's much of the poison channel as Matt Britton's is, to be honest with you.
Yeah, well, let's start, if we can, with Professor Lee Edwards. What do you think are the issues really involved in here for the public? Is this a crucial moment in terms of Ofcom? Is it fit for purpose?
So I think one of the things that that we have to recognise about Ofcom is that it's as you said, it's an enormous regulator, but it also sits at the heart of a really vital, complex but also conflicted space, this media space, with public service media in particular, the platforms, media literacy, spectrum as well, of course, is part of that picture. And I think that somewhat changes the nature of the organisation and its regulatory role, because it's necessarily oriented very strongly towards the public interest. And I think that there's an inherent tension in being a regulator, where the regulator instinct is to orient towards industry and towards policymakers. And yet with Ofcom, part of the reason why Ofcom exists is because we believe that media is vital to our public life, is vital to our individual and collective well-being, and Ofcom has to keep that, I think, at the centre of its thinking. And I think it's very hard to do that. So for me, that's one of the huge challenges.
Is it hard for all regulators, do you think, in these situations? I mean, we've looked at what happened in water and elsewhere, and people would say the great danger is the regulator gets too close to the industry and, from your perspective, too far away from the consumer. Is that a real danger with Ofcom?
I think it is a danger with Ofcom because I don't think that the weight of the public is taken into account in the same way that the intensity of the market dynamics, for example, of the platform environment, of the online environment, creates enormous amounts of pressure for Ofcom. It's not weighty in the same way as the politicisation of public service media that it has to deal with. And I think, bizarrely almost, the public often comes kind of a bit of a third space, if you like, that is a consequence, public well-being is a consequence of what Ofcom does as opposed to at the heart of what Ofcom does.
So are you saying there's a fundamental flaw in the design of Ofcom? Or Stuart's going to talk about the previous chair, Michael Grade, and the way he interpreted his role. But is it your view there's a fundamental design problem here that needs to be rectified? Or that actually with a new chair and with the right, as it were, guidelines, you can resolve some of these issues?
I think that's a really interesting question. I think one of the things about organisations that have things added to them is that they grow potentially without coordination. And the reality is that Ofcom has these areas of regulation, and it is, I think, very easy, and certainly publicly they're often talked about this, to see them as separate arenas. So this team will go and look at the OSA, this team will go and look at the Media Act, this team will go and look at spectrum allocation, etc. And the challenge is that in the world that we live in, all of those things are connected. And so if the chair is not able to go beyond the silos and look at the holistic connectivity, including the tensions that exist between those spaces, then the danger is that Ofcom operates in a kind of a piecemeal and slightly fragmented way, which means that in the end, the impact that it has on the cohesion of our democratic life, if you like, will not be as powerful and as positive as it could otherwise be. I think we have to, or Ofcom has to have in mind its broad role in society as much as anything else.
Chris, can I come to you, as you were there at the beginning? How much more difficult is the role now of Ofcom? It's always been difficult. Is it much more difficult now?
Yes, I think it's probably doubly as difficult as it was then. I think the advantage of Ofcom at the beginning was it involved three areas which they had specialism in before. There were 5 different regulators. It came together. And I would say at the time it was, and I would say that because I was there at the beginning, best in class in terms of regulation. It wasn't just another regulator. It was very, very different. There was also a very concerted effort to get what they believed to be some of the best in the industry to come in and then expected them to leave. Now, my fear is, as it's taken on other areas, as you've mentioned, for instance, online, it's had to tool up very, very quickly. I have no idea about whether they're good or not, but it's a very difficult area. Secondly, it has a much more, I would say, civil service attitude. I don't know whether that comes from the top, but people who have been appointed have a very civil service background or mentality. And
Sorry, can I interrupt? Do you mean by that, essentially, they're not independent, they look to the minister directs, and they implement?
No, I'm not saying that at all. I still believe generally that Ofcom is independent, but there's a different frame of mind. A civil servant's approach to problems is more likely to be the status quo, is more likely to behave in a particular manner. I do not say that Ofcom is at the beck and call of the government, but it does have a different mentality. And if you haven't got people who go in and out of regulation and industry, I don't believe, have quite the same level of understanding and expertise.
Now, can I come to you, Stewart, because I know you want to talk particularly about the last 4 years of Michael Grade as chair, and obviously very relevant with the new chair coming in. How, just the permanent secretary, the chief executive, Melanie Dawes, was obviously a Treasury civil servant and so on. How important is the chair in really deciding the most important things and the direction, the ethos really of the organisation? How has it worked for the last 4 years?
Well, there have been 5 permanent chairs and 1 interim in that.
Sorry, just forgive me. Can people hear at the back? Or are you all right for sound?
Okay.
No. Could you just pull that little closer to you, Stuart? Sorry. Yeah, forgive me.
There have been 5 permanent chairs of Ofcom and 1 interim. I worked under 2 of them, that's Lord Curry and Dame Colette Bow. And the 3 others, I didn't work for them with them at Ofcom, but I worked with them elsewhere. So I've got a sort of experience of all 5, plus actually the interim as well. And I don't think you can exaggerate the potential influence that the chair has. And it doesn't extend to kind of individual standards cases. I mean, I think Chris and I were there, certainly I was there during Chris's time, and I can remember standards cases where the government of the day would have had an interest, not necessarily a view, on the outcome of the standards cases. I was never questioned by the chair. I would get, how's it going, if you like, type questions, but I was never told, you know, this is something where we would like to avoid this or that. So I think on those standards cases, I think there is genuine independence. But what I would say is that the current chair, who actually expires today, if that's the right phrase for it, has taken a role which he would argue, I think, if you look at the Ofcom website, there is a list of the duties, and one of the highest up the list is leading the board in formulating Ofcom's strategy for discharging our statutory duties. So I guess Michael Gray would say that is what I have done. And I do remember the great debate about, if you remember, there's the whole thing before about whether Paul Dacre should be appointed. That was because I think in his interview, the way he would like to lead Ofcom was not thought to be necessarily the way that it would like to be led. But I think what we've actually now got over the last 4 years is a chairman who came from the content business. He'd worked at the Daily Mirror, London Weekend Television, the BBC, Channel 4 and ITV, you know, a formidable CV. And I have to say that back in the days when I perhaps worked closest with him, I was the editor of ITN and he was a non-executive director of the company. Michael Grade, as he was then, would often be the first to phone after a successful programme. He was actually probably the non-executive who was most interested in the content. In later times, I observed him at work, sometimes at quite close hand, inside Channel 4, BBC and ITV. And such was his experience and indeed his fame that he set out his own views with greater and greater certainty, while others around the table became increasingly nervous about challenging him. And I believe that is the story behind the last 4 years at Ofcom. And I think you asked about the role of the chief executive in that. I think the chief executive has been, in a sense, led by the chair. And the chair would say that was perfectly proper. Now, if you're looking for evidence of what I've just said, actually, it was in this very room. It was about whether politicians like Nigel Farage should be allowed to present the news on GB News. Now, Ofcom's decision, actually made on Lord Grade's watch and during a Conservative government, was that these were not news programmes, which definitely cannot be presented by politicians, but these were current affairs programmes which could be. Now, under pressure, Ofcom agreed to do audience research into whether viewers can actually tell the difference between news and current affairs. Sometimes if I'm asked to interview on BBC programmes, I ask the editor, is this a news or a current affairs programme? They look at me totally blank. They've no idea what I'm talking about because things have moved on where there were these 2 separate palettes, if you like. There's hybrids are everywhere. Now, when other Ofcom chairs might have come to the VLV to answer questions about that, they might have said something like, well, we've set out our reasoning on this. We've decided to do more audience research, and would like not to prejudge that research. Michael Grade said, I don't think it's very difficult what's a news programme and a current affairs programme. I don't think that's difficult at all. It's not confusing at all. Now, when the audience research was finally published, it proved that the Ofcom chairman was wrong. The audience was confused. Ipsos said viewers struggled to consistently tell the difference in practice. Ofcom didn't change its position even after separate independent research done commissioned by Cardiff University from YouGov, actually funded by the AHRC. It found public opposition to allowing politicians to front current affairs programmes. Now, last autumn, Ofcom potentially offered itself an off-ramp, as they say, to explore conducting further research into audience attitudes towards news and current affairs on TV and radio. But in Ofcom's current annual plan, the words current affairs have kind of melted away in that. In his valedictory interview with the Daily Telegraph, Michael Grade said, "I would die in a ditch rather than have Ofcom telling broadcasters who they can and can't employ as presenters." And Chris pointed out to me, actually, you already do tell them, Lord Grade. You tell them they can't use politicians as newsreaders. So that is a point which Ofcom and Lord Grade may have overlooked. So what lies ahead for the preferred candidate, as you say, Sir Ian Cheshire? It's not an easy task when your predecessor has taken such a public position on such a controversial policy, especially when the Culture Secretary, Lisa Nandy, said back in September that the government intend to act about this. How exactly that should be done has never been explained. My own view, adapting those words from the Ofcom website, is that Sir Ian, if and when he's finally confirmed, should lead the board in reviewing Ofcom's strategy for discharging its statutory duties in the area of broadcast standards. This comes as Ofcom is already beginning its review of the future of broadcast regulation. That review and the associated projects are listed in the annual plan under the heading Media, We Trust and Value. So the new chair, in my opinion, has plenty of options for bringing fresh thinking and leadership to this important area, and I wish him luck. And I'm grateful for you allowing me to get that off my chest.
Chris, could I explore some of the issues around impartiality, why we've got to the present situation we're in, specifically with GB News? There seemed to be a suggestion coming from Ofcom that there could be, let's say this is when GB News started, that there could be different, as it were, sorts of impartiality requirements. That there could be one requirement for the larger broadcasters which have significant audience, but that we really shouldn't ask a startup to have to operate to the same definition of impartiality. Now, A, is that true? Do you think that was the case? And secondly, what's happened now that GB News is rivaling Sky in terms of the numbers of viewers?
Well, to answer your first question, it is due impartiality, but the due really refers to the content and the context. I think what you're referring to was a statement in a speech made by Melanie Dawes where she said there was two types of impartiality, or there could be. Actually, interestingly, that was subject to an FOI request for information about how Ofcom came to that decision, and they actually, Ofcom pulled back on that and said that's not the case. We do not have a two-tier system. We actually regulate everything equally. Now, my argument is actually I'm not sure that is the case. There are different, or there appears to be different interpretation of due impartiality, certainly for GB News and some radio stations than there are to other broadcasters. And we are by the back door, and that's what worries me, having or getting a two-tier impartiality system. Basically, the public service broadcasters plus Sky News and everybody else. And audience expectations only take you so far. And why this has happened, I'm not 100% sure. I don't have any inside knowledge, but there are possible thoughts. It could be resources. I think that's unlikely. It could be being frightened of legal challenge because they let this go so far. It could be because of the strategy set by the chairman and the chief executive, or it could be just being overwhelmed by online and taking their eye off the ball. My view, for what it's worth, is I think this has happened accidentally. I think GB News was the new kid on the block. They wanted to give it a chance to settle in. GB News thought, this is quite helpful. We can do this. We'll push it a little bit more. We'll push it a little more. Ofcom gave them a little bit of guidance but didn't do anything. And it went so far, and then Ofcom couldn't pull them back. And now GB News and other news chain stations have a legitimate expectation that this is their business model. Don't destroy it. But we're now in a...
It was always their business model. I mean, you know, in order to... As Stewart knows more than anybody else, there's not a lot of money to be made in news, unfortunately. And therefore, what they were going to have to do would be to offer something which is the equivalent of what you're getting in social media, which is outrage or conspiracy or very strong opinion expressed in very potent language.
I would disagree with you because I don't think that was always their intention. Andrew Neil was very clear that it was going to have a right of centre agenda and it would serve other people. He never thought, and that's why he left, it was going to be this, what some people view as a rabid right-wing propagandist machine, which it is some people believe that it's turning into. That was never the intention. And, you know, Andrew Neil left after, what, 8 to 12 weeks? It's become their business model. And they realise, like online, that outrage produces clickbait online and it generates money. Now, they're still losing a lot of money, as do all news organisations. I'm not here saying that any news organisation makes lots of money, certainly broadcast ones, but it wasn't their intention. So there's been a sort of symbiotic relationship almost between Ofcom allowing this to happen and GB News taking a little bit further, etc.
And can it, you know, the horse bolted. I mean, could a new chairman actually say, no, you have gone too far, we want to look at this? And then the company would say, we're already lost about 120 million so far, you're just going to put us out of business.
You're absolutely right. So I think there are two potential issues here. Firstly, I think we need a very deep and open debate about what sort of broadcast media we actually want. Do we want a proper, regulated, impartial, duly accurate broadcast media that stands separate from online, or do we want to go the American way, which is to let everything flow out, and so be it? The other alternative is Parliament lets its intentions know. It actually clarifies the Communications Act in this area, and there are lots of ways of being able to do that, to say they shouldn't be getting involved in individual cases or individual channels, but say very clearly, this is what our intention is. Clearly, this is not how it's acting, so we need to clarify this. We need to clarify what we mean by impartiality with respect to current affairs or controversial matters, and we also, if they want to, say we do not want politicians presenting news, current affairs, or actually programmes that cover controversial matters. That is one way they could do it. If, you know, Stewart has said, Lisa Andy has said that she wants to act, well, that is one way they can act. I do urge them not to, though, do anything to reduce Ofcom's independence and get involved in individual cases or channels.
So, Lee, Professor Lee, do you accept that essentially this is Parliament needing to clarify what we expect and what we want in terms of broadcasting?
Yeah, I think that's true, with the caveat that you point out, which is that it has to maintain Ofcom's independence as the regulator, as the arbiter of cases. But there needs to be some kind of, you know, directive, if you like, that Ofcom is not empowered to make, and that relates back to this broader context in which these things are so important. Not least of which is Ofcom's own legitimacy and credibility. If it is perceived to be unable to act, or to act inconsistently, or to be weak, or to be too scared to use the sticks that it has in its back pocket for platforms, for example, to take that area as well, then it will simply become kind of an empty vessel, if you like. And then we have a situation where powerful market operators like GB News, with very articulate and robust and loud advocates, are able to then simply kind of bulldoze their way through public debate. And the public debate disappears.
Can I just pull it back slightly from sort of focusing particularly on impartiality, etc., and looking a little bit more at broadcast regulation. And Stuart's talked about Lord Grade, and I think he has stood up and said that he's very proud of how less regulation they're doing in this area and how less investigations they're doing. Just to put some figures on this, in 2019, Ofcom published 142 investigation cases. And in 2025, that number had dropped to 36. Now, in fairness and privacy, which I've been involved in sort of since 2000, fairness and privacy are cases made by individual organisations who want to complain that their privacy has been infringed without justification or been treated unfairly. That has hardly changed over 20 years. There's always been around between 160 and 240 complaints every year. On average, over the last 10 years, 37 have been published. Last year, there were 3. And of those 3, 2 were about the same BBC programme. So this is not just us saying, you know, that there's something wrong. There clearly is something going on there, which I don't understand, whereby there's a lack of clarity and transparency. In some of these cases, I would argue, are important cases of public interest. And sorry, just very quickly finish. I was advising a broadcaster on impartiality last week, and I found it very difficult to give advice in this area knowing what has occurred and been allowed in the last year. I found it extraordinary that I was having to say yes, but, which I've never had to do before. And I think if I'm finding that, broadcasters in certain areas must be finding complying with Ofcom's due impartiality, accuracy and misleading rules very challenging.
Now, could I just look a little more closely now at GB News? Because there were some people who would say this is not an accident, the position that we've ended up in. And they would point to Dominic Cummings talking about the desire to fundamentally destroy the BBC, and one of the things that would be required there, well, a number of things would be required. One was gradually throttling it financially by cutting its revenue, and the second would be to create the space for organisations, as it were, to outflank it, such as GB News. And when you look at GB News, it's not really a commercial concern, is it? It's funded by Sir Paul Marshall, evangelical Christian hedge funder, who also owns The Spectator and I think Unheard. The other owner is the Dubai-based Legatum Institute. These people are in it for politics as much, rather more than profit, and we've had Sir Paul himself making a speech attacking the BBC and its existence. I think he compared it, I don't want to be unfair to him, as a toad in the hole, in the middle of the road, but something like that. So what we've got is a deliberate attempt to destroy the BBC. And my experience of going on and trying to defend public service broadcasting on there is that, on the whole, they only choose to feature the BBC when they can kick it. They do an opinionated introduction. You try and explain some of the complexities, okay, and then afterwards the panel they've got rubbish the BBC and would say that anyway. I mean, that is just the experience that you have, and you wonder, by going on, are you actually allowing them to claim that they're relatively impartial because, look, they've got other people there, or you're actually just assisting them in their game, which is so obviously to destroy the BBC. Now, does this matter? Do we say, well, it's the market will sort things out, but the market isn't sorting it out because this is being funded by a group of people for a political purpose? Stewart, is that an overstatement by me?
Well, Liam Byrne has written a very interesting book which this comes up in, and you have done an excellent interview with him, Roger, on your podcast, and I would commend that to anyone who hasn't heard it. Let's say there are separate strands here. Whether you should and could connect them is arguable. You've got a strand about the fact that GB News is paying Nigel Farage a shed load of money to appear on the programme. So his salary as an MP is being heavily supplemented by GB News.
He's, by the way, got 500,000 shares.
That was going to be my next point.
Yeah.
He has 500,000 shares. GB News has also started, what I'm told by my sources inside GB News, is a very successful club. You can join this club and be a supporter of GB News. I've often wondered who has access to the database of that club, because that would be a very interesting database if you were interested in recruiting or fundraising. You've then got the issues that come from the Legatum Institute in Dubai. What exactly is their interest in these matters? So I think that these are threads which require further investigation and also relate to the issue of the ownership of channels, which is another matter which Chris also knows a lot about. So whether Liam Byrne is right to take it to the level he has in talking about the threat to democracy, was that the phrase he used, something like that, is another matter. But there is clearly some separate strands which merit further investigation.
I mean,
Yeah, so, come in, Lee.
I mean, I think also this relates back to the point about the emergent two-tier impartiality or multi-tiered impartiality. So if we have a very loud anti-BBC voice that Ofcom is failing to crack down on, and then we also have regular challenges to the BBC and its impartiality that Ofcom clearly takes very seriously, as it should, then in some ways it is implicitly buying into or reinforcing the narrative that the BBC is the problematic broadcaster and GB News is the broadcaster that's telling us all what's really happening.
It's
And
common
I think
sense.
that's a real
It's
danger. I think
GB
it's a real
News is
danger.
common sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that there is a kind of a vicious cycle or a vicious spiral, if you like, that emerges if that pattern continues.
I mean, what I would argue is that it is possible that we are all overplaying the influence of GB News as a broadcaster that reaches about 80,000 people a week, as opposed to Facebook, Instagram, all those other things. And it is perhaps a time that this needs to be looked at. However, what I would argue, the current regulations and law say that broadcasters must be duly impartial, must not mislead, and must be duly accurate. Now, that is a 23-year-old piece of legislation, and those standards have not changed in 23 years. In fact, Parliament has extended all those rules to video on demand 2 years ago in the 2024 Media Act. So now all the most important or the most watched video on demand services, Netflix, etc., have to comply or will have to comply with due impartiality rules. So Parliament 2 years ago set that out. If they decide actually, you know what, this doesn't matter. Ownership doesn't matter now because we've got Instagram, we've got all this social media, or they decide that actually we should let the market decide, let them decide that. But what I worry is that on paper we have one system and in practice we have another. And I think that's the worst of both worlds.
Being truly impartial, is there anybody from GB News here who would like, or anybody who takes a very different view, who would like to comment at this point? Right, sorry, ma'am. Sorry, just hold a sec. No.
Is it working? I'm sorry. It's only to say I can't speak personally, but my neighbour is a great follower of GB News, and but she has no idea about the Nigel Farage sort of links. And any time I have pointed out to her the way Nigel Farage has placed himself in the media and influenced, and his close relationship with Trump, she's appalled. And so when I tell her this information that I've learnt today here, she will be appalled. And I think, you know, this is part of the difficulty where people's understandings of, you know, the politics behind it, it's just not known to people. It doesn't really contribute to an answer to a question, but it is a case study, as it were, for a listener of GB News. I'm sure many of them don't have any appreciation of what these things going on behind are influencing what they're hearing.
Yep, please.
I think one of the really important points that your neighbour and her reality brings up is the fact that at the moment we have not had an extensive public discussion about the way the media landscape has changed, about the role that public service media now has in our lives, about the importance of other alternative providers, and the kind of the range of the political spectrum that we want visible in the media and that we want to be able to use and learn and understand about in particular ways. And you cannot do that without making space for a properly informed debate where the public are told background information like this and can then make an informed decision. And for me, I think a big part of, I'm also the chair of the Media Reform Coalition, we've argued previously that Ofcom, in its audience research and in its reviews of public service media, needs to start integrating some proper, extensive public discussion about the nature of media, not just PSM, but the broader media landscape, so that we understand when we say, yes, we want to keep the BBC well-funded, yes, we want to find a way to make sure it can survive in this highly competitive landscape, and we want to treat GB News in particular ways, and we support our regulator in doing these things, we have the proper kind of foundation on which to make those decisions that Parliament could then act on. I think without that public input, and we know the public can do this. Some work that I did with Giles Moss in the Small Screen Big Debate research that Ofcom led was admittedly small but very important citizens' assembly where when people had the information about public service media, they were able to make really informed, intelligent, reflective and considered arguments about why it's important or why it wasn't. And I think those are the conversations that we also need to have as part of this kind of ongoing debate about what Ofcom should be.
Can I pick up on that? Lee's mentioned the word citizens, because it's worth remembering in the debate in which the bill was debated that became the Communications Act, there was I think David Putnam took a particular role in this, Lord Putnam, because there was a House of Lords, I think it was a joint committee of some kind. And the word consumers was constantly turning up in the legislation, and the word citizens was inserted as, if you like, a counterbalance to consumers. Now, what I found in my time, and again, I should be grateful for Chris's thoughts on this, was that tension permeated the organisation in a sense that we, if you like, looking at some of the broadcasting issues, were always trying to remember the citizens' interests. And there were other parts of the organisation that were always trying to emphasise the consumer's interest. And that was, that was in a sense, the joy of the place, that you had those debates in a pretty positive way. But one of the points of evidence of my concern about this was the continued attempts by senior members of Ofcom to actually kill off the content board. Now, the content board was created as a counterbalance to the main board. It was all part of the consumers' citizens debate. And I do remember that at one point when a Conservative government came looking for cuts, the content board was offered up as a cut. It survived to this day, but I understand it is not of much influence inside the organisation. And I think that's a pity, because I think some of the people who work on it are exactly the kind of people you would expect to have broadcasting experience and broadcasting input into discussions. But I think from looking at their minutes, they're not overworked on the content board.
Do you think that we've missed an opportunity here, though? Toro, I tend to talk about this as if GB News is something that shouldn't have been allowed to happen. But going back to the principle of having, let's say, the Andrew Neil vision of what GB News, that actually that might have been a valuable addition.
Absolutely.
So you're not, none of you are opposed in principle to that idea.
I know. I mean, I'll just get this another point. I have never had a problem with a programme which chooses right-wing talking points as its agenda, because regulation does not extend to the agenda. It is about the way that individual stories that the producers and editors choose to cover are covered. So if somebody wants to run a programme with either left-wing talking points as the agenda or right-wing, to me, it's the way that these items are produced and the way they're presented. And so I think you're right. I think an Andrew Neil style agenda of those stories of interest to the right. I mean, if you take, for instance, I listen each morning to the Today programme, and I listen to Nick Ferrari on LBC. And I feel that way. I am hearing two different news agendas, and I think that's fine. Now, do I necessarily agree with how either of those programmes, cover both those issues or the issues they choose to cover? It's not always perfect, but I think that's a healthy thing to have. But actually, when you cannot trust the broadcaster to actually cover the story in an impartial, fair way, that's where the system goes wrong.
Although you can say bias exists in the choice of the agenda rather than anything else. And people would say, a Legatum Institute, which is offshore, has plenty of money to flush around and to advocate policies which will enable them to continue making significant profits and not have regulation wherever they are, and that an organisation that wants to produce perhaps another different perspective would find it more difficult to find the finances and certainly to support a essentially loss-making enterprise. And that's one of the difficulties. Sorry, questions? Anybody like to raise? Right, okay. Can we come, gentlemen behind the I'll come to you, sir. Yeah.
Thanks. Leo Watkins from VLV and Goldsmiths. So the thing is, we have in law a prohibition on political parties and religious bodies being able to own and operate channels. What is the difference between a political party being able to own and run a channel and a channel being privately funded and run to support one or two particular political parties of a particular point of view, right? In other words, what I'm suggesting is there are bits and pieces of law and regulation in the UK that amount to, effectively, a suite of rules that is designed to prevent the emergence of a strongly partisan broadcaster. And there's a very good reason for that, which is that we don't want people to have access to both a partisan press, partisan online websites, and partisan TV channel, because then you get total immersion in a partisan point of view, and that is exactly what has produced the kind of what the authors of a book called Network Propaganda have described in the US as a propaganda feedback loop, where basically everything you encounter all the time through your media diet throughout the day confirms you in your point of view, and you're never exposed to any impartial content, right? Another point, briefly, is just that the impartiality requirements around current affairs programs do say that, yes, you can have a strongly point of view program from a left or right perspective, but the overall series must be impartial in terms of the range of different perspectives that are expressed across it. That's obviously not possible if a current affairs program is consistently presented by someone who is like the leader of a particular political party, right? So in that sense, it's impossible under the current rules, I think, for a current affairs program to fulfill the impartiality requirement, which is in the Communications Act. But on this point about partisan...
Sorry, hold on. That's
Sorry.
such an important point. Bruce, would you just reply to that?
With the first one or the second one?
Both.
Both. Okay. So on the first one, I think you have to step back a bit and just ask yourself, do we still consider as a society broadcasting is special? Because going back to 1954 Television Act, that's where standards and particularly impartiality actually started. Now, actually, ironically, that was because spectrum was so scarce that they required these special requirements. Now we're in the other place where there's so much for want of a better word, garbage on social media that's out there, nobody can trust. You could argue that actually it's more special now, or you argue it fights its place in the marketplace. But that is the question, is it special? Secondly, on politicians as presenters, we have to remember that politicians as presenters actually existed before 2000. I actually worked on a programme that had a variation of politicians presenting. I think it was called House to House or Powerhouse. And they had a variation like election broadcasts. What GB News has done is he takes the same right-wing politicians, normally mostly from Reform now, and has them always, and Ofcom hasn't adjusted it. It should have intervened and said, you've got to have a variation, like, for instance, LBC does. And I think we're now in a situation where it's gone so far that it's up to Parliament to say, we do not want politicians having second jobs, or we don't want them to be presenters. Now, there are some European member states, or they're not member states anymore, some European countries that do prohibit politicians as presenters. And I think we need to ask ourselves that question, whether now it's gone so far that we should do that.
And the final point, sir.
Yeah, sure. I just wanted to suggest then that one thing that government could do here is it could, in this potential new media bill that it might put in, make a set of changes that are designed to stamp out partisanship in media, right? So one element of that would be to clarify, as you suggest, the rules in the Communications Act to make it clear that you can have no politicians presenting programs. Another dimension of it, though, would be to introduce clear rules around partisan affiliations of people who go to work on any of the boards of Channel 4, the BBC, Ofcom, so you don't have the problem of something we haven't mentioned about Michael Gray, which is, or maybe not mentioned, it was just he was a Tory peer when he was appointed. You shouldn't be able to be the chair of the media regulator if you have a partisan connection. You know, maybe if you had one 10 years ago or 15 years ago, okay, fine. But you shouldn't be able to be a Conservative peer sitting in the House of Lords voting on issues and also the chair of the media regulator. We know from international evidence that authoritarian regimes, one of the first things they do is they try and staff the, all the key regulatory agencies with people who are basically under the control of the party or the broader movement, right, who are partisan. So why not say, well, we're going to try and sort of stamp that out at every level. We're not going to have politicians presenting programs. We're also not going to have politicians making regulatory rules, and we're going to apply that to our side just as much as to the right. If Labour were to do that, surely that is an argument it could win. Anyway.
Lee, would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, yes, I would, and I think that's a great idea. Sorry, I haven't really been across that part of the media policy world.
I would commend to everyone here listening to, watching Dame Melanie Dawes being interviewed by John Nicholson at a select committee hearing. She seemed not to understand that there was a problem. Maybe it was her years at the Treasury. I'm not suggesting that the fact that she was married to a former Daily Telegraph editor made any difference at all. But she seemed not to get it. And that hardened my heart towards Oxford. I was going to say Oxford. To Ofcom.
Can you specify what you think particularly she didn't get?
She didn't get the idea that politicians involved in programming in that way was... She didn't seem to get the idea about it being run essentially in the Beaverbrookian way as pure propaganda. She just didn't seem to get any of it. It wasn't quite as good as Nadine Dorries talking about the business model of Channel 4, but it came second in select committee prizes.
Would any of you like to... I mean, how does one explain that? I mean, isn't it explainable? A highly intelligent person who's worked at the Treasury, who's chief executive of Ofcom, and...
Well, I think one of the strangest things Melanie Dawes said was to imply, if not to say outright, that we needed something like GB News because the BBC was the other side. In other words, a view that there was a liberal mafia, if you like, that was running the country. So we needed a right-wing mafia to have their say. And I think, well, if she really thought that was the case, shouldn't she do something about it with the BBC? But if you accept that point of view, it leads you into the most terrible places. And I think that's the result. I mean, I just wanted to add one tiny point. You remember, we haven't mentioned the New World analysis initiated by Alan Rusbridger of the output of GB News. One of the many interesting things that came out of that was the people who saw it possibly for the first time called it Reform TV. And what they noticed was that Rupert Lowe, a man who fell out with Nigel Farage and started his own party, which I saw in some polling the other day was doing actually quite well as a rival right-wing party, had not been appearing on GB News for some time. And after that was actually published, he appeared the other day on GB News, and his opening words were very interesting. "How nice to be back," he said, "and how kind of you to ask me." Clearly, he realised he was being stopped from broadcasting on GB News. Why he was not being covered in GB News, when you think about it, he's meat and drink to GB News viewers. But perhaps because he's fallen out with Nigel Farage, could that have been a factor in why he was not appearing?
Yeah, one might add that the 500,000 shares that Nigel Farage have are voting shares. Very few staff members have voting rights. He has.
One other thing that concerns me, as well as due impartiality, is the potential for misleading material not to be challenged on some of these channels and stations. There is a deluge of climate change hoax type speech. Now, absolutely, there is a debate to be had, and everyone should be able to express their views in line with freedom of expression. But where there is clearly misleading information about health, about vaccines, about climate change, about health and safety, there's no one quite often putting the alternative view. And that is really quite problematic, and potentially more problematic than impartiality issues. And again, I don't see Ofcom investigating these cases. And most worrying for me is that when they don't investigate or they decide there's not a breach, they don't publish the reasons for those decisions. That goes against both transparency and is also very difficult for the industry to have any understanding what decisions they're making and why. And you look at the number of not upheld decisions, which is just actually as important as those found in breach, to explain why they don't find it in breach, it's again plummeted. So I don't quite know what they're doing in this area, and that worries me.
Tim, right at the back, yeah? You could, thanks.
Thanks, Roger. Yeah, Tim Wilson, Media Policy Consultant. I mean, I've lost count of the number of responses I've written to Ofcom consultations and meetings I've had with Ofcom. So I suppose I speak as what you might call a punter or stakeholder for a number of different organisations. And I mean, I've been nodding furiously, actually, about, I mean, Stewart, I'm so pleased to hear what you said about Michael Grade. I couldn't agree more. Chris, I mean, your point is, I think it's really at the nub of it. And if we go back to the headline question of the sessional sort of, if I'm the chairman, I'm coming in and I'm sitting everybody down and I am simply saying, and Peter, if you hadn't mentioned it, I would have done the John Nicholson Select Committee thing, which is really astonishing. You know, what are you here? You're a regulator. What are the regulations? What did the government intend to do when it brought those regulations in? Read it, look at it, implement it. I mean, Chris, you said regulation's complicated. Actually, it can be really quite simple if that's what you do. I feel as though Ofcom is trying to kind of be a bit zeitgeisty. Going back to that point you just made about, you know, do we need a GB News a bit biased because people are saying the BBC is biased and therefore implicitly almost saying that they think it is. Like, forget all that. You're there to implement the regulations, read the law. Why is it there? Just quickly, this morning there was reference made to the consultation on prominence. Ofcom's proposed way of making sure that PSVs are prominent on connected TVs, etc., is really weak when you look at what the government intended. I mean, the minister literally said when the bill was going through, they wanted the PSVs to be the first things people see. And yet Ofcom says it's got to be among the first things, but it's also allowed the user to just completely change the order of what appears on their screen once they've taken the TV out of the box and plugged it in. So it's almost meaningless when you consider what people can do. And that does not, to me, read like the implementation of what that whole campaign on prominence was about, which was saving the futures of PSVs by making sure people, you know, had them right in front of them when they switched their television on. And that is what I think is, Ofcom is weak. It seems to be swaying in the wind when it should simply look at the legislation that led to the regulations. What's it there to do? Just interpret it straight down the line. And if I'm the new chair, I'm just taking them back to school and going, guys, that's all you need to do. Forget the rest. Just do your jobs and be absolutely. That's what we all expect of regulators, isn't it? To be actually quite boringly straight down the line and just do what they're required to do. Sorry, a bit of a rant there, but
thank you very much. When we come to the end of virtually the end, I want to ask each of our members though to say they've got a 5-minute meeting with the new chair. What do they tell him? Stewart, what do you tell him?
Well, presuming that it's going to be a man, I would say be your own man. Don't feel that you have to follow the line that has been followed for the last 4 years. You have a chance. There are ways of taking stock. There are ways of perhaps initiating conversations with government about potential need for legislation. It doesn't have to be this way.
And how about you, Chris? What's your 5-minute conversation?
For the one to not being John Major, I'd say go back to basics. Go back, as you said, to the Communications Act, see what it says, and carry out your statutory duties the way that you should do. Proportionality, targeted at those cases, transparency.
And Lee?
I would agree with both of those things, but I think I would say remember the bigger picture. Remember the role that Ofcom has in the contribution it makes to the health of our democratic well-being, to the well-being of individuals. Remember the public. Remember the public have a voice and they are important, and involve them wherever you can. And I think then they'll have a stronger foundation for making the kinds of decisions that act in the interests of citizens rather than just consumers.
So you're all suggesting the game isn't over, it's reversible. Let's hope it's reversed. Thank you very much indeed to our panel.